So this is the obligatory sponsor slide, which you've probably seen. I actually, as it turns out, work for the logo at the top. I didn't put it at the top, they're at the top for all of them. But so that's me. My name's George, as I say. So we'll let a few more people come in. So here's what I want to talk about. Here's what I'm really interested in. I'm really interested in this fog, right? So what I think is true all around the world, and I think it's true with the clients that I'm speaking to in India as well, is that we've gone from this world where people don't understand the importance of digital transformation, right? It's no longer this kind of willfully blind, we don't see the importance of the internet, we think it's a fad. Everyone gets it, right? Everyone gets it, of course they do. The trouble is they don't really know how to get there, right? They know that it's important, but they don't really know what to do, and sometimes, often, they will, transformations fail, right? I mean, a lot of transformations fail because fundamentally, it's an incredibly complex and difficult thing to do. And we wrote a white paper recently, which, if any of you want, then obviously just tweet me or grab me afterwards, and we'll get you a copy, of talking about the 9 common reasons we see transformations fail. And what I want to do today is talk to you about some of those. Probably won't get a chance to go through all 9, but go through a handful of them, and hopefully we'll make it a little bit interactive. So those are the 9 things, and we'll come back to some of them. So the first one I want to talk about is actually, if anyone saw me talk at the customer event yesterday, then the first one is a repeat. It's the only thing that is a repeat. So you'll have to keep quiet because there's a question I'm going to ask now, and you can't shout it out if you were there yesterday. Right, so what I'm now going to give you is the dullest statistic in the world that's going to make you think you've picked the wrong talk to come and see. It's going to make you think you've picked a talk on accountancy, right? So here's an interesting fact. There's 2 types of assets for any business, right? When you value a business and you get a share price for a business, there's tangible assets and there's intangible assets, right? Tangible is stuff like the stage, it's land, it's cash, it's buildings, it's all the products and widgets. Intangibles are things you can't hold, right? And in 1976, the percentage of intangible assets for the 500 biggest companies in the US, right, so of the 500 biggest companies, only 16% of their value, of their share price, was made up with intangible assets. The rest with it is exactly what you'd expect from an industrial economy. It's all about the value of factories, it's all about the value of stuff and the shares they hold. Right? And my question I'm going to ask you in a couple of minutes is, what's that number today? And the reason I think this is fundamentally important is because we all come here and we talk about the importance of customer experience. No, it's very good. You should buy Sitecore and you should employ all of us or spend lots of money to get Sitecore because customer experience is very important. But if customer experience was very important, actually customer experience is an intangible. It is one of the key intangibles. In fact, the 2 biggest, there are some accountancy areas, but the two of the biggest movements over the last few years have been from marketing and IT, right? The people in this room saying that actually software, which is intangible as well, and the brand should be on the balance sheet. So if what we're saying is real, and if we genuinely believe that customer experience leads to competitive advantage, it's not just nice to have a fluffy website whilst the adults get on with running a business. If we believe that what we do is important, then this number should move. And I'm going to ask you in a couple of minutes what that number should be. And I've got a couple of slides to talk about those 2 movements first, which I think is fundamentally important to understand. And this will get back to a lesson. So this is what businesses look like traditionally, right? The industrial economy, before the rise of digital, there was 2 philosophers or economists that defined the Industrial Revolution. One was Karl Marx, the other one was Adam Smith. One said it was good, one said it was bad, but they basically said the same thing. They said, if you want to make money in the industrial economy, you own the means of production. You buy a big factory, you need lots of capital, lots of money. You buy a big factory, you hire lots of people, and you mass produce something with economies of scale, right? So, like the Henry Ford model, right? He just reduces the cost of the car so much that actually it's so much cheaper. And that's how you make money. Fine. But as I say, there was this movement that started about 40 years ago, about the time of that statistic in the 70s, where first of all from marketing started saying, this is not right? Actually, the value of the properties, the value of the company is increasingly not in the bricks and the mortar and the old industrial things. It's actually in what we talk about, in brand, and which has led to now customer experience. So as CEO of the 20th century, John Stewart said this. He said, if the business was split up, I would give you the land and bricks and mortar, and I would take the brands and trademarks, and I would fare much better than you. And in terms of software, so Bill Gates, who you probably all know, said this about when he was starting up Microsoft. He was saying, it took time for the investment companies built on intangible assets. In the early days of Microsoft, I felt like I was explaining something completely foreign to people. They couldn't imagine what returns they would generate. The point being is that the people in this room, the marketeers and the engineers, we believe in what we're talking about. And so if it is true, then actually that number should move. So my question is to you now, who wants to give me a number? In 1976, intangible assets, like customer experience, were for the 500 biggest companies, the S&P 500, that number was 16%, and I hope none of you have Googled it. That number was 16%. What do you think that number is now? Sorry? 95%? That's punchy. Anybody else? 75%? I mean, it's obviously gone up, but I mean, how much has it gone up? How much do we believe? We talk about this, this is what we based our careers on. How much is the value of the business based on customer experience versus tangible stuff? 40%? I mean, it can't be 100% because, the land and the building still are worth something, right, if you just sold them off as scrap. But how much? I mean, how important is the work we do? When we do transformation, why is it so fundamental that people do transformation? So, the number of intangible assets in the S&P 500 this year is 90%. So, since 1976, the value of the largest companies has shifted from exactly what we tell people, from the industrial, buildings and factories, and that's how you make money. That's what the value is in a business. And the important thing is that's incredibly easy to copy, right? If you're thinking about it, if you're running a business and you want to copy one of your competitors, you go, what I really need is capital. I'm just going to buy a factory that looks like his factory or her factory, and I'm going to hire some people that look like, and you compete it. But intangibles are impossible to copy. It's so incredibly hard. And actually, the opportunity, I would argue, the people and the lesson here is what people often do. The most common mistake that I see over the years, in my experience, is people when they go for a digital transformation, what they actually build is a tangible website, but what they should be building is an intangible customer experience. And they should recognize that their competitive advantage is now increasingly in customer experience. And I know we all kind of know that, and many projects start off like that, but do we always structure the delivery like that? When we get down, when the rubber hits the road and it gets into sort of, talking about what are we going to build, actually what we end up building is, some technology and some nice, imagery and that kind of thing. Are we always focusing on customer experience? So the lesson and the hashtag that I think, I've got a hashtag to kind of sum up in terms of transformation. The one thing I always think should be kept as the key driver and key focus and key objective of any transformation is defined in this hashtag. And it's set against this black sky because I think that intangible assets are a bit like dark matter. I don't know if there are any physicists in the room, but we used to think we could see everything tangibly, and then suddenly we discovered actually 95% of the stuff in the universe you actually can't see. That's 90% of the value of businesses you actually can't see. And hashtag that I think should always, it's a mistake not to keep it as the objective is this, CX for CA, customer experience for competitive advantage. Fundamentally, the mistake that most failed transformations make is they build a lot of technology, often with huge investment, but they don't deliver competitive advantage because they're not focused on it. So figure out whatever competitive advantage is, figure out what is the transformation in your organization, and drive mercilessly towards that, and don't let it just devolve into a building of tangible things we can quantify. Right? And that's incredibly hard, but that's also why it's worth it. So hopefully that made some sort of sense, and that's the most common problem, is just that lack of focus, and once you get into delivery, it doesn't work out. One of the other things I would argue as a follow-on from that is that this is also another challenge I see. So one of the ways that you can actually keep CX for CA in mind, one of the things that very rarely happens on those projects that go poorly, is the visualization of what a customer wants. Because what are we saying? We're saying that fundamentally consumers have changed. So in 2025, India will be the third largest consumer consumer country in the world in terms of expenditure. You have a 12% expenditure year on year against a global average of 5%. Like, the absolute story of India, if you don't mind me as a complete foreigner talking about it, is just the huge boom in consumerism, right? It's unbelievable. It's remarkable. It's unparalleled. And that consumerism brings with it the very need for why businesses have to change. Because you can no longer just mass produce thing and knock it out and they'll buy it. Actually now, what do people want? They want what they want, when they want, across time, across channel, across device. So as Steve Jobs says, you've got to start with the customer and work backwards. And the best way you can do that, I believe, is to visualize it. So I was going to use this analogy, which many of you also might have heard of, the quarter-inch drill bit, the bit that goes in the drill. So it's a common thing, many of you have heard of it, but I had this old boss that used to say this all the time, which I used to really love. He used to say, every year in this case, this is in the UK actually, every year in the UK we sell 3 million quarter-inch drill bits, right? And then he'd say, much to his hilarity, how many people want a quarter-inch drill bit? We sell 3 million every year. How many people want a quarter-inch drill bit? Nobody. Nobody. They want a quarter-inch hole, right? It's just a tool. And in fact, they don't actually really even want a quarter-inch hole. What they want is to hang some shelves. Well, why do they want that? They want to clean up their room. And why do they want to, clean up their room? I don't know, so their partner thinks that they're responsible and doesn't leave them or something. Really what they want is, a loving relationship. You've got to get to the heart of what consumers want to be able to offer it to them. They're not going to tell you. They'll just tell you faster horses. And the important thing there is that is the importance of actually defining user needs and finding a way to link that directly to technical architecture. So, really what you're always looking for, in my opinion, this is a process of service design, which I'll try and cut short, but basically you're looking for this magic spot. This is where the functional spec is. You've got to spend time looking at user needs. If you don't, you're screwed, because what you're trying to deliver is change in customers' behavior by giving them something they want that is also gives them a positive behavior. They select a competitor rather than you, they're more loyal, whatever it might be, and something that's profitable. And what you can get to as a visualization of that service design to link user needs, so it doesn't just exist as research that no one ever touches, but actually gets carried through into delivering transformation. I'm going to do it in a very simple way to save some trouble. Just use an example of a recent project. There's a global health insurer called United Health Group, which is like 250 billion worth of company, which is like, I don't know about you guys, but that feels like a big to me. And they recruit a lot of people. So we did this for them for their recruitment division rather than their commerce. And they said, we want you to implement Sitecore. And we went through this process. And ultimately what we did is we saved them 50% off their cost per hire. The only reason I'm telling you this is because they hire 60,000 people a year. So that's obviously a lot of money, right? But this is directly to their competitive advantage, right? This is directly using customer experience to give them what they want. So this is the number they wanted to move. And what did we do? We basically did a process of service design. I'll keep it very brief, very high level. Many of you have seen service design blueprinting. The important thing to realize is this is not it, but the actual one that they have exists on the wall, for the CEO, for the CMO. And every time a new project, a new initiative, a new app, a new whatever is brought to them, they're like, tell me how it's going to make this customer experience. Because that's how you keep CX for CA focused, right? You have to understand, and you can't really do that in words and documents because people don't read that. They understand a picture. So, again, this is a simplified version of it, but you break down, you understand from the customer's point of view, what are the stages of interaction, and then you literally think about it like a conversation. So, do you know the conversation you are attempting to orchestrate? Do you know the customer experience? So from a user needs perspective, you do some research and they said, oh, actually, we want personalized job ads specific to me. Well, okay, so thinking about that Venn diagram, how do we actually, why is that useful to the business? Okay, well, personalized job ads are incredibly useful because actually not all candidates are made the same. So we all know it's very difficult to find superstar Sitecore people. So actually, if a Sitecore dev superstar actually happened to wander onto the recruitment section, if you could identify him or her early doors and know that they are through, personalization, know who they are, then the value of that visitor is incredibly different to the value of a graduate from a location where we don't have an office or, So yes, we are giving the customer what they want, but by very definition as well, we're also increasing the value to the business to understand who they are, so then obviously we can push messages to them, so we can offer them the right type of roles. Relevant imagery and content, customers want that. So you've got a question to say, well, if that's the user need, why would that be valuable to us as a business? Why is it worth our money? So this is kind of obvious. No one wants to get to a recruitment site and see lots of people and things that don't seem relevant, loads of stock imagery. So what we did is we did a bunch of research, and for United Health Group, they're like really type A people, if that means anything. They're like really into it, like really aggressive. Like there's one guy who in the weekends he was like a volunteer firefighter, right? And he was like running up buildings and stuff. These are not sort of quiet, meek actors. And what we found is whenever someone who wasn't a type A person joined the organization, often they'd leave pretty quickly, right? So by using imagery of firefighters, you're much more likely to appeal to the right candidate and not to the wrong candidate. My point is not to talk about recruitment for UHG, but it's to say everything starts with a conversation. Understand the customer experience that you're trying to create. Understand the conversation with your customer. And then you can, once you know what that looks like, you've got to say, okay, well, if that was a play I was trying to put on, what would I need to do backstage? What would that mean for my paid, earned, and owned media? Right? What would that mean for the data layer? One of the key things here is, grabbing the knowledge of the individual, increasingly identifying who that person is so you can tailor to them and find them the right role and their value to you. Well, actually, that's a data. So where does that data sit? Doing it in a logical way. And, of course, what you eventually end up with, and this isn't it, but, you end up with the beginnings of a logical architecture. When you start to think about, and clearly that was just some boxes I put together, I'm not technical, but like on the real one, what you'll see, which I obviously can't show you, is you start to see how the conversation that marketing want, that the business want, that will lead to more customers, or in this case, recruits at a cheaper layer, that starts, what does that mean in terms of the interfaces? Okay, how are we going to do this? Okay, there's a bot. Okay, what does that mean? And of course, increasingly, what is the decoupling of responsibility between systems? And I've done this in multiple different places, and it's remarkable to me how often big companies make huge investments into transformations. They have multiple systems and multiple agencies and hire multiple people, and they just really are unclear about what the responsibility of each of those systems are. And like, there's a commerce system. What's that going to do? Commerce. All right. Well, this system also does commerce, and where are the gaps? And once you start to get to this stage, I'm not technical, and so I'm sure that you guys will know much more about this than me. But the reality is what technical architects are. Once you are able to decouple the systems and the responsibilities, and you understand what each of these systems are doing, you can start to bring that about, and you can start to also then validate and say, well, this is where the data sits, and this is what it's attempting to do, and we can always trace that back. And any business person doesn't need to understand anything about technology or marketing to get there. And so hopefully that makes some sort of sense as to, if the first lesson is around how do you keep the real objective in mind, which is a customer experience that delivers competitive advantage. One of the key ways to do that is to visualize it. Understand what kind of customer conversation would give you competitive advantage, and understand how all of the work you're doing relates to that. And in this instance, obviously, some of them cycle and some not. So hopefully that makes some sense. The third thing I wanted to talk about is maybe a little bit more controversial, is how a project plan should wear in, not wear out. So one of the most common mistakes that leads to a failure of transformation, in my experience, is people who try and answer all the questions on day one, even though that is by very definition the day you will know the least, right? So let me explain that a bit more. Here's another question for you. How much does it cost to build a space shuttle? A lot, okay. Does anyone want to quantify? It's not a trick question. I don't even, so shout out a number. 20 million. 20 million what? Okay, we're doing USD. Anyone else? Higher, lower? All right, so I'll be honest with you, I actually don't know the answer to this question, right? But this question was asked a few years ago, a few decades ago, by NASA. And what they did is they took these really clever people, who, NASA got a lot of them, took these really clever people and they asked them without any context, they just said, how much is a space shuttle? And they'd say stuff like, well, I don't know, how big, where do you want to go? And they're like, no, I'm not going to tell you anything. How much is a space shuttle, right? And that feels sometimes a little bit like, what we have to deal with, right? How much is a website? How much is it in commerce? How much is that going to cost me, right? Fine. And that's a reality, and you can understand why. So what I want to talk about is what NASA concluded from that study, which is something called the cone of uncertainty, which is a thing, you can Google it, and you may already know about it. And what they said is this. They said that what everyone wants to do is they don't know anything about anything, and they want a direct line to a project that, and they get the exact number, right? So in this instance, it could be an estimate. They want the precise number, or it could be a scope, right? Which is a more interesting conversation to have. People just want to know, what's the scope? What is the scope? What are all the things you need to do? Build me a plan, build me a backlog. What are all the things? Well, we don't know. So what they actually found, roughly speaking, when they're speaking to these NASA guys, is about plus or minus 400%. So, what the actual answer was, they'd say, look, if this is, $1 million USD, actually, some people come in at 4 million, some people are 250,000, and that's basically what it is. And so how do you deal with a challenge like that? Because the reality is that if you actually are starting with an estimate that's off, you're just going to drive to the wrong thing. Or in scope terms, if you get the wrong scope here, if you try and define it day one, you're going to end up building the wrong thing, and that's why your transformation fails. You're going to build something that doesn't produce the conversation that you want to have with your customers. So the solution, more often than not, which I actually think is wrong, is to do this. People say, okay, so we need to reduce this scope of uncertainty, so we're going to spend an awfully large amount of time and money and effort building a PowerPoint, which we're going to call discovery phase, and answering all the questions we can answer in the abstract in order to reduce certainty. Whereas what I would argue, simply because I'm an advocate of agile and lean processes, is that reality, what you should do is have a feedback mechanism. That the reality is that time and time again, throughout all natural and man-made systems, whenever you are faced with a complex problem, a problem that is not just complicated, but is complex, that is by definition impossible to answer. I don't know if anyone knows anything about sort of chaos theory, but it's so chaotic that you cannot actually answer the question. There is a way to deal with it. Right? There is a tried and tested process. You see it in evolution. You see it in open source programming. You see it in predicting weather systems. The only way to deal with chaotic questions that cannot be answered is feedback loops. Right? So, natural selection is a process of feedback, right? And we need to have a process that continually feeds back. Because if we actually, what we're looking for is a process that doesn't just build in a straight line, but a process of actually learning and removing and reducing risk. There's a book which some of you may have read, came out quite a while ago, about 10 years ago, by a man called Tal. He also wrote a book called The Black Swan, which you may or may not know. But he pointed out this. He said that there's a lot of people who think that when you're faced with disruption, the key is to the key is to be robust. That the defense against fragility, the defense against not knowing, the defense against being at plus or minus 400%, the defense against just simply starting out and not have done the learning yet, is to be robust and be resilient. Whereas in fact, what Tala pointed out, who's a mathematician, is that it's the reverse. It's that what you actually want is a process that's strengthened through disruption. And that is essentially all agile and lean processes are saying. And I am yet to genuinely encounter a successful program of transformation anywhere in the world that knew the scope of what it was trying to deliver on day one and delivered it. I've never seen that. It is as much a process of learning, and you have to, and the only way you are going to get there, the only way you're going to get to the end point, the only way you're going to get to competitive advantage is if you take an anti-fragile approach. You use that disruption, you use it to learn and to build. And if you think of, people think that, and again, many of you may disagree with this, but people think, so agile is something, I know you develop quicker, you can code quicker or create quicker or count quicker in data. It's not that. It's just a process of understanding the user stories you shouldn't be building before you build them. That's all it is. It's like the guy who says, I waste half my marketing budget, I just don't know which half. Exactly the same. We start off with a backlog of scope, and we probably don't need to build half of it. You just need a process of learning to understand what is the half of the user stories you don't need to build, and that's how you get there. Anyway, so hopefully that made some sort of sense. And what I'd also argue is that it's actually better for the user to do it in this way. So, we have this incredible opportunity within digital that wasn't available even in the 90s. So, if you had to ship a product in the 90s, it looked like this, right? It was, Windows 95, you put it on a CD, and, the day after you've printed all these CDs, you find out there's a bug in it, and that's tough because you've got to wait till Windows 98 to fix that bug. Whereas now, as we all know, there's just a fresh sort of deployment to your phone, and it's that sort of iterative process. We have this ability now to continue to improve the experience in real time based on the feedback of users. Because, if I was to take my phone and I was to ask you, you're all very clever people, I was to shut the doors and I was to say, right, I want you to build the RF chip in this phone, right? That's what I want you to do. It's an iPhone. I want you to build the RF chip. I mean, that's a complicated thing, right? But there's probably a bunch of PhDs and clever people in here, and you can probably figure it out. I mean, it's a soluble problem. You don't need, you can probably figure it out. We get you enough pizzas and, beer and such like, and you can probably build the RF chip. But if I ask you, what is the correct user interface for me? What is the correct collection of apps that I need? You can't answer that. It's a chaotic problem. There is no soluble answer. It's not just a clever thing. The only way you're going to find out is by asking me questions. How do you use your phone? That's all I'm saying, right? You need feedback loops. You need a process of learning. You need a process of feedback. And it's not just better in terms of the efficiency of development and getting what you need, but it gets you to the competitive advantage you need. And that's what I believe is the reason that the Agile Lean movement is so successful. And honestly, I'm sure maybe they do exist, but I've never seen a waterfall, discovery-heavy transformation that has worked. You have to accept that every day you're not just building, but you are building to learn. The fourth thing, so I'm just going to talk about 5 things, you'll be pleased to know. So the fourth thing is something else which is less at a technical level or a creative level and more at a psychological level. So there's a man called Jeff Guffel, who some of you may or may not know, wrote a book called Lean UX, which is quite popular, and he had a great saying in it. He said this. He said that the biggest lie in software is phase 2, which I really like because it kind of sums up how I really feel about, I fundamentally believe in minimum viable products, right? But clients, you say MVP and they're like, oh, MVP, that's fantastic. And what they hear is, we'll do the work cheaper. And what we fail to do, both on the client side and on the agency side, is to take planning for phase 2 seriously and to handle and manage expectations to achieve that, right? And so what we end up with is, go live date is in September, and September happens, and suddenly we aren't suddenly moved from 16% to 90% of intangible value in our company, and oh my God, this is a failure. There's something wrong with the product. Fire all these developers and get me new ones. Because we don't realize that it's just phase 1. And if you are going to use feedback loops, that the business needs to understand, and the program needs to be set up to continue to plan for them and to manage expectations about what will be done. When I also hear this, I also think underpants gnomes. Do any of you know the underpants gnomes? Hopefully this will play. So sorry, can we turn the volume up? Or is that a thing we can do? Maybe we can't. Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to wind it back and we'll have another go. If not, you might just have to, you have to be quiet. I'm just playing this out of the speaker.
Underpants that you steal. Collecting underpants is just phase 1. Phase 1, collect underpants. So what's phase 2? Hey, what's phase 2? Phase 1, we collect underpants. Yeah, but what about phase 2? Well, phase 3 is profit. Get it? I don't get it. You see, phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 2, phase 3, profit.
So I don't know if you were able to hear that, but if not, you should go on YouTube. But it's from South Park. And that's sometimes what it feels like, right? We need to be realistic. What we're trying to do is transform a business from an industrial economy to a digital economy. We're trying to give consumers what they want, not focus on production process issues in our manufacturing line, but actually customer experience issues at the consumption level. We are trying to reorganize the company as a process of doing it, and we need to manage expectations about what's achievable. And so when I look at, when I look at the SUGCON maturity model, and as many of you will know, this is being revamped and there'll be a new version out this year. But when I look at this, and I don't know if you've ever seen it, I don't actually have it, so I can't show you, but some of the SUGCON salespeople will do this great slide where they'll say, but the interesting statistic is that the majority of customers are still here. And there's very few customers to get to the end. Because the reality is that, when people, in my experience, when people are upset with Site4 or one of the other platforms, what they're actually upset with is that they bought this stream and they're paying for this and they've got this. But it's not because there's something wrong with the product, because there are people at that end. It's because they're stopping at phase one, right? And so there's, and this S-curve, which you'll have seen in different guises before, gets talked about for different things, and I think it's directly applicable to how we do transformation as well. So Gartner used it. You probably have seen this where they talk about, a new thing like, blockchain comes out and it reaches the peak of inflated expectations, and then suddenly everyone's like, oh, there's no actual decent blockchain project, so you get to the trough of despair, and then you've got to kind of crawl and climb your way through the sort of slope of enlightenment through to the plateau of productivity, right? And that's what it's like. You get this initial hype, and then you get despair. And the reality is, this is shockingly hard work. I mean, it's really hard work. Transformation is incredibly difficult. And there's a man called Seth Godin, who many of you may have read his books, and he talks about this. He's got a book called The Dip, and he just calls this The Dip. And he too talks about it a lot in terms of personal career, and we'll all know this, right? You start a job, you're 6 months in, you're like, oh, this is the best job in the world, everything's really amazing, and then you're like, oh, this is just so tough, because it's really difficult, right? And lots of people quit. They quit in the dip, right? Because it's human nature, right? And he said, this is Seth Godin, he says, it's human nature to quit when it hurts, but it's that reflex that creates scarcity, and it's scarcity that creates value. Because the reality is that the fact it's so difficult is the great opportunity, because so few of the competitors will do it, right? So if it's in transformation, most of the competition will be here. Very few can get there, and that's what will give you the competitive advantage, right? And in terms of your career as well, I think it's applicable. If what you did was as easy as, I don't know, working a checkout in a store, then you'd get paid the same, and then because everyone could do it. But what you do is incredibly difficult, and that's why you get paid more. Exactly the same with transformation. But the reality is most people do not push through the dip. They'll get upset after phase one and they don't push through. And it's our responsibility in whatever role you have, client side, agency side, whatever, to understand that there is a dip and we need to push through it. And how do you do that? My advice is, whenever I get asked the question of what is the value of project management, I come back to the dip. So here's another question for you before I say, what have swimming and transformation got in common? It's that you can't learn to do either by looking at a PowerPoint, right? People who say, we shouldn't start transformation until we know everything, so we've done a big, large discovery phase, till we've sorted out all of the, crossed all the I's and T's, dot all T's, or whatever that is. It's like saying don't get into the pool until you know how to swim, right? The reality is that we're not going to know that. We're not going to know what phase two looks like. We're not going to know all the ins and outs. But what we should do is have a strategy and have an approach and have a project that actually wears in rather than wears out. And so, ultimately, what does that mean? That means adopting the right behaviors in terms of how you approach a project and enforcing those behaviors, because they will get you to the right place. So, you were pleased now I've run out of time. So I won't go through them in detail, but there's a bunch of accepted best practice, in my opinion, in terms of what are the right principles to take forward and how we deliver. And it's these principles that will get you through the dip. You've got to believe in the process, just like the process of swimming. You jump in, you think you're going to drown. You've got to believe that you can get there. And it's exactly the same thing. Enforce the behaviors, and it will change the expectations in the business. Don't try and do it the other way around. Don't try and change the ideas and then think everyone will magically behave in the right way. And I think it's the last one. I think it's number 5. I think I got numbering wrong. The other thing I'd say is I think it's incredibly important to accept that when we work together, be it in agile teams or whatever that team looks like, that we need a very flat, a very cross-functional team. Again, I'm yet to see in my personal experience, and I've done this in 5 or 6 different countries around the world and many different cultures, from so Europe to the US to the Middle East, in India, and I've done it in Australia and Malaysia as well. And I'm yet to see a successful transformation team that delivers in the long term and wasn't cross-functional. Because often, if you're a developer and you have a problem, you don't need another developer, you need a designer. Or if a designer has a problem, they need a developer or a data scientist. And it's got to be cross-functional. And so my advice there is that don't have too much hierarchy within your project team, including with important clients and product owners. And so the thing I'll leave you with is this analogy. So the way I always think about it in terms of what do you want your colleagues to be? You don't want them to be waiters, and you don't want them to be brain surgeons. So at one level, what you don't want is, if you're a developer, you don't want to be a waiter. You don't want to be standing there and say, what do you want? What do we want? If you could spec it, we'll build it. Like, that's just not useful, right? Whatever you want, sir, I have no opinion. I'll rustle out the back and get you one of those websites. Just tell me, would you want it in green or you want it in red? I don't mind, right? There's no use, right? Everyone has a point of view and everyone has an opinion. You don't want a waiter. But by the same token, you don't want to treat your colleagues in whatever position they're in as a brain surgeon, because you don't, by the same token, want someone, if you're going to go in for brain surgery tomorrow and the doctor comes around to see you and he's like, hi, I'll do my best tomorrow, you're not going to say, Doc, I've been looking over your approach and I see you're coming in through the prefrontal cortex with a certain type of size of drill. I wouldn't take that approach, actually. I would actually come in. You're not going to say that because, you don't know, right? And likewise, you don't want to, with any of your colleagues, if you're the most creative person in the world and you know nothing about development, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have a point of view about the approach a developer's taken, right? Because it shouldn't go, oh, well, you're the techie. I don't know, I couldn't possibly know, and vice versa. If you're technology, you shouldn't be saying, I don't have an opinion about the creative, because the two things are synonymous. They're both the intangible assets that produce the value. They're both two sides of customer experience. And I know from a lifetime of asking stupid questions that often it is the least qualified person in the room who has an insight that no one else can see. And you've got to find a way, if you're in charge, you've got to find a way of bringing about this collaborative, cross-functional way where people can speak. Because what you want to be is in the middle where successful teams win. They can constantly look back on the visualization, the blueprint, and say, well, look, we are no longer if we build like this, we're not going to build this conversation that the business wants, right? And you've got to find a way to bring that together, have a successful team. And you'll be very pleased to know that that was the final slide. So hopefully that made some sort of sense. There are only 5 of them because I didn't have time to do all 9. But obviously if you're interested in the other 9 or interested in the white paper, then either come see me or come see Damesh over there and we'll get you a copy. But thank you very much.